The stone did not yield. It sighed. A low, ancient breath spilled from between the coffin lid and its cradle, a gust that tasted of resin and tomb dust and time. The lanterns trembled. A rope creaked. In that quiet, a field notebook slipped from cold fingers and thudded into the sand like a heartbeat no one wanted to claim. Later, the story would be told that the desert exhaled, that the tomb itself spoke. In truth, it was only air. But the line between air and omen is thin when the dead have waited 3,000 years to be disturbed. They called it the tomb of Nesemun, the keeper of secrets of the House of Life, a scribe priest in the shadow years of the 19th dynasty. Not a pharaoh, not a god-king, just a man with a name and a place among the dead. But what lay around that name was different. Black oil hardened like tar, walls that gleamed when the lamplight touched them, as if they had been polished with midnight. A curse that was not theatrical, not the overblown poetry of modern translations, but hard and specific as a knife. My breath shall be your breath, my death shall be your death. The one who disrupts my silence will never find theirs. They found the tomb in a desert that no map cared to honor, a wadi that cut its own path through the western waste like a letter written in a language no one uses anymore. The expedition came because a satellite saw a line, just that, a seam of darkness beneath the sand, geometry where the desert had no right to be straight. They followed a rumor, they followed a shadow, and then they found a door where a door should not be. Before we go deeper, take a breath. If you are drawn to the quiet rooms of history, to the places where belief and bone and dust meet, subscribe for more. Comment your thoughts. Do you think curses in history can wield power, or do we simply give them power when we fear them? The first night, nothing moved. The second night, the wind shrieked in a way that sounded like metal dragged over stone. On the third, the first of the team would deadpan joke that they were being watched, and by dawn, he would be on his back in the sand, eyes rimmed in red, coughing something that did not look like life. They told themselves it was coincidence. They told themselves it was dryness, fatigue, an old cough agitated by dust. It is easier to live with a rational lie than a supernatural truth. The tomb waited. That is what tombs do. That is what the dead do best. But everything alive around it began to hurry towards stillness.
There were 24 when they first rolled the generator into the wadi, all angles of determination and recklessness. There was Dr. Alistair Finch, lead archaeologist, silver hair bleached whiter by the sun. Dr. Nabila Farouk, epigrapher and conservator, who rolled papyrus under her tongue like a prayer. Omar Helmi, the local inspector, a man with lines carved by a life spent keeping order against chaos. And behind them, a cohort of archaeologists, students, photographers, and conservators, whose names would soon become a litany. They arrived in the late winter, when the desert is all bone and no muscle, when the wind strips the world down to truth. They traced a scatter of limestone chips to the entrance, sealed with the signature of the necropolis, a lintel of black basalt that drank the sunlight and held cold in its heart. At its base, someone in 1200 BCE had placed a footprint, carved, not real, the foot of the tomb owner, stepping out of his chamber, a charm to walk into eternity. Finch stared at Foot, and for the first and only time that season, looked as if he might choose to turn away. Inside the first chamber, torchlight found the red handprints of restorers long dead, preserved by soot. The walls bore figures in brittle, elegant lines: jackal-headed Wepwawet, the opener of ways; Thoth, the scribe god who writes and erases with equal mercy. And in the serene center, Nesimon, a small man before a greater table, inhaling the scent of offerings as if the perfumes had not dried to ghosts. The paint was alive. Lapis pigment still glowed where blues had not been stolen by salt. Ochre was stubborn as old blood. There was text, so much text, a river of hieratic flowing like a spell across the plaster. He who takes my name removes his own shadow. He who drinks my offerings drinks bitterness. He who breaks my jar, his heart is the jar broken. No jackals in the corners, no cobra poised to strike from the lintel. The poetry was not a threat, it was the arithmetic of exchange. For every act, a counterweight. For every theft, a silence. Behind the first room, they uncovered a corridor swaying with false doors, slits of stone carved to confuse the dead or the living, depending on whom you asked. The air was old in a way that does not simply mean stale. It smelled of earth that had not known the sun since the last time cedar oil perfumed it. It smelled of myrrh. It smelled of stories that had never had to fight so hard to be believed.
"Do you hear that?" Nabila asked on the third day, lantern held high as she traced a line of glyphs with her eyes. Finch listened. The generator thumped. The sand whispered under someone's heel. "It sounds like breathing," Nabila said. "Not dramatic, simply true." The corridor narrowed and then widened into a chamber that had been sealed with such meticulousness the ancients had sealed their own seal. Bitumen, thick as ruin, smeared over a door that had been painted with two eyes, the ujat, so that the dead could see out. Someone long ago had wept those eyes. The paint ran like tears. They cut through the bitumen with heat, careful, controlled. Resin cracked like brittle sugar. From beneath, the trapped air rose, and everyone recoiled because there is no romance in the truth of tomb air. It is not simply the breath of pharaohs, it is chemistry. Carbon dioxide heavier than comfort, hydrogen sulfide sneaking up like a sullen dog, radon that does not smell of anything but long memory. And yet, the air felt like a hand pressed over a mouth. Beyond the bitumen door lay the heart of it, a room with a ceiling low enough to force humility, the walls lacquered with something that turned their lamplight into a black mirror. Nabila smeared a fingertip, sniffed, frowned. Not paint, not in any conventional sense. The ancients had mixed bitumen with char and resin, had polished it until it swallowed light. The effect was disorienting. Your reflection wavered on every surface like something trapped beneath ice. At the room's center, a sarcophagus of red quartzite, its surface bruised with incised spells. On the lid, a figure of Nesimon, small enough to be tender. Around the base, jars the color of old honey. A bronze cobra bolted to the wall, its hood flared, its eyes inlaid with something dark that caught the light without returning it. Against the far wall, a single stela, half hidden under a shroud of soot that had been applied like a veil. It is strange how often it is the obvious that kills us. No one wore a respirator that first day because respirators are uncomfortable, because the air tasted like history and people who love history want to taste it. They would later. They would order them. They would insist on them. They would enforce them. But on the day the tomb was opened, on the day the air moved for the first time in 1,000 years, most of them took off their masks to smile.
That night, in the field tent, under a sky so savage with stars it hurt to look at, they catalogued, sketched, argued, and told ghost stories. The first cough began as the humorless little cough of a man who needs to clear his throat to make a point. It did not stop when the point was made. The man, Sami Kudur, geochemist, 47, father of 2, stood, the color in his face gone the color of the quartzite lid, and stepped outside into the cold. He bent to hook and found blood. No one panicked. The desert will skin you for panicking. They made tea. They told him to rest. At dawn, Sami was worse, the blood brighter. By midday, his pulse insisted on the hospital. By evening, they had wrapped him in a blanket and driven him out of the wadi toward the main road. He did not reach the clinic. Technically, the death certificate would later say pulmonary hemorrhage. Practically, the last thing he saw was the sky. The next morning, Omar Helmi found the generator leaking oil like a thing that had been stabbed. He cursed quietly, patched the line, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked up to see the bronze kubra open its mouth. It had been always open. That was the trick of the light. But the sensation of something watching is a parasite. It burrows, it multiplies, it breeds its own evidence. "Bad air," Finch said briskly. "We do this properly. Masks, filters, rest cycles, wet down the dust. We keep the door open. We respect the chemical, if not the curse." "Respect both," Nabila said, and not like a joke. When they lifted the lid on the sarcophagus, a task that required pulleys, patience, and a sense that the room itself was resistant, a second breath slid out. This one colder, wetter. The mummy of Nezamun was not operatic. He was small, his skin lacquered with resins until it looked like burnt sugar. The linen wrappings had fused in parts into a crust like bark. His fingers were delicate and ringless. His mouth was closed. His eyes, of course, were not eyes. The weight of his stillness changed the air in the room. There is a gravity to remains. You feel it in your knees like weather. They found 3 tiny amulets lodged in resin at his throat, a heart scarab carved with lines so fine the carver must have breathed in between each cut, a jed pillar, the backbone of life, and a strange piece, a single obsidian bead threaded on linen and glued to the skin. Unusual, odd, dangerous only to those allergic to curiosity. Nabila wrote the inscription around the heart scarab in her notebook. "Do not stand against me as witness. Do not say my name in the presence of the tribunal. Make my heart my friend." There were signs of haste. The jars, 4 and no more, were misaligned. A coil of rope lay behind the head of the sarcophagus, as if someone had dropped it and never returned. The soot that veiled the stela in the corner had been smeared by fingers that moved fast. It is hard not to read fear into ancient fingerprints, but fear is one of those things that is invisible until it is not.
The stela, once cleaned with the painstaking strokes of someone terrified of erasing, told a partial story. It named Nezamun as a keeper of the House of Life, the temple scriptorium, not a magician, but keeper to magic. It mentioned a famine and a theft of sacred oil, a novice who was punished in ways the text took pleasure in describing, and a ritual of enclosure. The phrase was not common. It looked like this: the breath of the enclosed. "What is the breath of the enclosed?" Finch demanded. Nabila squeezed the bridge of her nose and said the thing all scholars are forced to say when the past denies them. "We don't know. Not yet." By the end of that week, the first 3 flies were pinned to the glass of their plans. Sami, dead. A scaffolding collapse that dislocated a shoulder and a spine. A lantern that burst when no one was near it. In the 3rd tent, the youngest team member woke to find sand poured over her pillow in the shape of 2 eyes. She did not sleep the next night, or the next. On the 8th day, they opened the first canopic jar, a carved limestone vessel with a human-headed stopper that stared, without malice. Inside they expected the resin-packed organ that had once been a liver. They found black sludge that smelled like the inside of a coffin after rain. This "This is wrong," Miriam Rosen, the expedition microbiologist, murmured, eyes narrowing. "This looks cultivated." She did not mean farmed, she meant grown. What began as a story of discovery became a story about a room that expired a poison no one could name, and a string of deaths that could be explained one by one, and yet could not be explained at all. The Stella, once cleaned with the painstaking strokes of someone terrified of erasing, told a partial story. It named Nesamun as a keeper of the House of Life, the temple scriptorium, not a magician, but keeper to magic. It mentioned a famine and a theft of sacred oil, a novice who was punished in ways the text took pleasure in describing, and a ritual of enclosure. The phrase was not common. It looked like this: the breath of the enclosed. "What is the breath of the enclosed?" Finch demanded. Nabila squeezed the bridge of her nose and said the thing all scholars are forced to say when the past denies them. "We don't know. Not yet." By the end of that week, the first 3 flies were pinned to the glass of their plans. Sammy, dead. A scaffolding collapse that dislocated a shoulder and a spine. A lantern that burst when no one was near it. In the 3rd tent, the youngest team member woke to find sand poured over her pillow in the shape of 2 eyes. She did not sleep the next night, or the next. On the 8th day, they opened the first canopic jar, a carved limestone vessel with a human-headed stopper that stared, without malice. Inside they expected the resin-packed organ that had once been a liver. They found black sludge that smelled like the inside of a coffin after rain. This is wrong," Miriam Rosen, the expedition microbiologist, murmured, eyes narrowing. "This looks cultivated." She did not mean farmed, she meant grown. What began as a story of discovery became a story about a room that expired a poison no one could name, and a string of deaths that could be explained one by one, and yet could not be explained at all.
People die around excavations. Desert work is hard. Machinery fails. Roads turn to sudden yawning mouths. There are scorpions. There is water that sometimes pretends it is clean when it is not. These things kill, but they do not pound. Not like this. Death 1. Sammy Cadre. Hemorrhage. Likely mold exposure, the older doctors would shrug. Aspergillus flavus can be a vindictive spirit. He had asthma. He was tired. The autopsy did not mention curses. Death 2 would not come at the site, but in a white-tiled hostel in the oasis town. Lena Zaki, photographer, 27, awake too late, editing the blue-black sheen of the tomb walls, complained of numbness in her lips, then her fingers, then a soft spinning that suggested the room had shifted without moving. She stood to find a glass of water and fell, her head hitting the corner of a cheap table with a sound like a gavel. The coroner wrote subdural hematoma. The team wrote it in their ledger without tears because there was dust stiffening them to an unnatural stoicism. In her last folder of images was a photograph of the bronze cobra, mouth open. Death 3 was not death, not then. It was the violence that lives under skin until a trigger asks it to step out. At dusk, the wind came hard, as if the wadi had been turned into a throat for a god. The tents bowed, then snapped their ropes. Hassan Qasim, a foreman with hands the color of old leather, went to save the equipment table, because that is what men do when things are thrown at them. The folding leg failed with a metallic sincerity. A box of blades spilled, and one kissed his wrist. By nightfall, the cut was red with too much persuasion. By dawn, the veins above it had gone the color of green olives. The hospital would use words like necrotizing and sepsis and unfortunately, and then Hassan would stop needing words. By the time they acknowledged a pattern, they no longer had control of it. It has a way of happening like that, like a plank of wood sliding off a roof, not because it decides to, but because all the small insistences of gravity finally agree. The death ledger grew, its entries read like miniatures, the kind painted on little wooden boxes that hold the hair of the dead. Dr. Edwin Clark, professor and patron, 60s, face down in his coffee cup in the afternoon shade, the steam lifting off his drink like smoke off a ruin. Heart, the report said, a heart that had lifted crates too long, a heart that had not taken its pills. Yet in his pocket, folded 4 times, was a slip of paper in Nabila's hand with a fragment of the stela. He who drinks my offerings drinks bitterness. Clark had asked her to write it out because he liked the way the letters curved. No one likes to think words can be teeth. Josephine Vale, conservator, finger skilled enough to coax colour back from the edge of oblivion, found at the edge of the wadi with her shoes in her hands. Heat stroke, dehydration. The simplest deaths are the most humiliating because they invite contempt. But Josephine had left her tent neatly, had tidied her brushes, had covered the open pigments, and pinned a note to the flap that read simply, "He is still breathing." They assumed she meant the tomb, or someone inside it.
Rami Salim, driver, not an archaeologist but part of the machine, bit by a horned viper that had no business being in his glove box. He laughed as he shook his hand because he had been bitten before and the venom had been kind to him. It was not kind this time. The clinic had antivenom. The clinic was too far. At his funeral his mother said the snake had been placed. No one corrected her. Dr. Nabila Farouk's assistant, Amal Fathi, the sort of woman no one notices until the world collapses and she is the only one holding it up. She went home for a weekend to see her grandfather and did not come back. They thought she had resigned. Only later did they learn she had drowned in a canal, walking to a shop that sold tea and cheap plastic bulls. John the Baptist, the priest later said at her burial, and then remembered where he was, and said nothing else. Yusuf el-Masri, excavator, hit by a falling stone that had been steady for 1,000 years and chose that hour, that minute, that second to learn envy of birds. His friend said he had told a joke about ghosts so obscene it would raise the dead laughing. When the stone fell, Yusuf did not hear it. He was laughing still. Miriam Rosen, microbiologist, who insisted on swabbing the soot from the stela for analysis even as the generator growled and spat out a cough of black. 2 days later she ran a fever like a bonfire in a sandstorm. They put her on antibiotics, they put her on fluids, they put her on prayer. In the hospital, the doctor with tired wrists told her it was likely aspergillosis, that her lungs had become a garden. Miriam said, lucid as a bell, "I think we have found a ritual, not a disease." She died murmuring a number that did not equal days lived. Karim Haddad, architect, edges and measures his faith, fell from the scaffolding in the second chamber when a rope that had not been cut and was not frayed and did not look like a lyre decided to become one. The HSE inspector called it fatigue. Karim's wife found his notebook and discovered he had written in careful lines that the tomb did not accept symmetry. "Everything the exact width of my hand off," he wrote, "as if someone measured with a hand that is not mine." Dr. Alistair Finch's old friend, Peter Reynolds, a donor with a habit of asking intelligent questions, died quietly in his hotel from what the doctor wrote as silent pneumonia. He had spent a single hour in the tomb. The rest of his time he spent reading in the lobby, in the expensive chair under the painting of the Nile that was not the Nile, but a wealthy European man's memory of water. Sana Carmel, surveyor, the only one who could look at a blank desert and tell where a wall lay with nothing but a rod and a set of eyes like razors. She vanished. This is not dramatic. People vanish in deserts. But she vanished where there was not enough desert to allow it. Her footprints went to the mouth of a rock cut and did not come out. 3 days later, when they had given up, she walked back into camp without tears and with no memory of where she had been. She lived 30 hours longer and went to sleep with her shoes on. They buried her with a compass in her hand, so she would not lose the path.
Omar Helmi, the inspector, who walked upright into every dust storm in his life, began to dream that the walls were closing, and woke 2 nights running with his nails bloody from clawing at the tent canvas. On the 3rd night, he went and sat with the bronze cobra and asked it a question he had never dared ask God. At dawn, they found him seated. He had died where he sat, eyes open, mouth open, as if arguing. The autopsy said, stroke. The obituary said, service. The whisper in the wadi said, keepers die keeping. 9, 10, 11. The ledger thickened. The story grew skins. Other names joined, each with a line that sounded banal on paper and unbearable in memory. A visiting journalist who stayed to smoke a cigarette and left with a cough he did not shake. A conservator who put a fingertip to her tongue by accident to smooth a corner of paper and spent a week with her mouth tasting of metal. She died not of the taste, but of a bus that decided that brakes were optional. Theories trailed in behind the coffins like professionals at a wake. The rational men and women arrived, the ones with meter sticks for souls, and they measured. They measured the air, elevated carbon dioxide, traces of hydrogen sulfide, high radon. They measured the walls, bitumen impregnated with something, arsenic compound, formaldehyde analogues from ancient embalming that outgassed when disturbed. They measured the dust, spores of fungi older than the argument about gods, fragments of mold that had slept until mouth and lung gave them back their teeth. Miriam had been right. There was cultivation here, something deliberate, whether for preservation or punishment. But it is not only biology that ruins us, it is also the animal that lives behind men's faces. Money flows wherever dead things are wrapped in gold. Politics attends funerals it can exploit. There were whispers of a smuggling ring that wanted the obsidian bead because it was rumored to hold a map in its glass. There were whispers that someone had 2 passports and had borrowed a 3rd. There were whispers that the local police, the national service, the foreign press, and a university with a building fund had all decided which narrative would keep them whole. When the 19th name was wrung out of the ledger, the team stopped speaking aloud in the tomb. Silence is a superstition of the practical. They took off their hats and put them on their chests when they passed the bronze cobra, as if the metal could smell respect. They burnt frankincense, not to please gods they did not believe in, but because the air felt less cruel when sweetened. They began to see things in the polished black of the walls, the dead moving behind themselves, Nezimun lifting a hand, the bronze cobra's eyes taking them apart and counting them. We call this escalation, as if the curse learns. We should perhaps call it recognition. The living learn to hear. Then came the death that made even the rationals throw down their tape measures. The 20th. Before the 20th, the ledger must be read against a larger book. Egypt did not invent the curse, but Egypt perfected the contract. In the Old Kingdom, tomb walls were blunt. May jackals eat the violator, make crocodiles chew his bones, a physics of fear. As centuries gathered, the texts became more elegant. The justice was not rendered by scavengers, but by balance. In the Middle Kingdom, the curses began to speak of names erased and hearts weighed against feathers. Only Anatolian gods want blood.
The Egyptians preferred accounting. What you steal here, you lose there. What you take with hand, you surrender with shadow. The Valley of the Kings carries dozens of warnings that say exactly this, but in the language of immortality. To one who enters, I will seize his neck like a bird, I will wring his head. We forget that this is measured mercy. The thief is still given a throat to be seized. The throat is the seat of voice. The fatal thing in Egyptian belief is not the body's ruin, it is the loss of name, the second death. Tutankhamun's tomb carried no flaming neon curse. The deaths around it in 1922, Sphinx-like, were half biological, half theatrical, and wholly useful to the newspapers that wanted the Orient to play villain in a story of plunder and possession. Lord Carnarvon's death from an infected mosquito bite birthed the legend. The lights of Cairo flickering at the hour he died did not hurt the story. But in truth, if there was a curse, it was the curse of human bodies failing after long labor in a place they did not fully understand. The myth remembers the drama, the facts remember the dust. Other tombs did not play so coy. TT 320, the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, held a family of kings whose faces looked like masks until you saw their fingernails, their hair, their teeth the color of old gold. The men who found them, guided by a tribe that had long kept the secret and long eaten from it, suffered not supernatural revenge, but the revenge of law. Imprisoned, paraded, humiliated. Divine retribution outsourced to bureaucrats. A curse is simply one version of justice. The Serapeum at Saqqara, where memory lives underground, did not kill men mysteriously, it let them die under collapsing ceilings. The mastabas of the Old Kingdom whispered nothing, and swallowed men who laughed too loudly. At Abydos, the graffiti of pilgrims who believed the god in the ground would hear their names repeats the same plea, "Be gentle with me." The living borrowed the tombs of the gods because gods do not lose their patience as quickly as guards. Nasaman's tomb departed from some norms and embraced others. Bitumen on walls is not unheard of. But this level of polish, this hunger for light, was peculiar. The soot veil over the stela was not merely concealment, it was a filter. The text beneath spoke of the breath of the enclosed. The House of Life Perranque was the temple where scribes and priests kept the secret names of gods, the recipes for pigment and the recipes for power. If Nasaman was keeper there, he did not simply copy, he contained. In a time of famine, the stela implied it plainly, the House of Life might have been a storehouse of something more dangerous than grain, resentment.
In famine, tombs are robbed. In famine, curses are invented, whether in stone or in rumor, to police the starving. Divine retribution in Egypt is the continuation of law by other means. It threatens the worst thing a person could fear in that world, to be unremembered. To be unspoken, to have one's name devoured by a god who eats the unworthy. The Amit, the devourer, waits at the scales, crocodile head, lion's mane, hippo belly, all the survivors of the Nile's moods. A curse says, make no mistake, the gods watch like crocodiles. And yet, even in the land of balance, there were men who put teeth into their curses. There is a text from Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders, that reads, I shall seize his neck and make his blood come out. I shall do likewise with his son. It is the voice of a foreman. It is the voice of a man tired of men. If a scribed priest had access to resins, to arsenicals, to bitumen, to the recipes of embalming, could he not render the breath of the enclosed literal? Could he not brew an air that punishes? Science would argue the miasma of a sealed room, radon seeped from granite, fungal blooms sleeping in desiccated linens, arsenic in pigments ground with sweat. Superstition would argue a spell given flesh in gas.
Politics would argue someone eager to make a story into currency has been cutting ropes and salting glove boxes with vipers. The truth, likely, is uglier because it is so unromantic. Many small blades, each dull, together bleeding a life away. The ledger of 20 should not be possible in a modern dig. Protocols and respirators, training and triage, contingency and conservative caution, they are all designed to keep tally to a minimum. But the desert is both modern and not. Ancient hazards do not enroll in today's regulations. The ancients buried their dead with their knives sharpened. The living walked in with skin. There is a part of the story that does not fit into law or folklore. It is the part whispered by men who sleep and women who wake, that the tomb was loud, that in the stillness it had a sound like breathing, that it remembered what had been said and answered.
The 20th death belongs to the man who believed in tape measures and still carried a pocket charm his grandmother had given him, Dr. Alastair Finch. He had avoided being a character in his own story for 60 years by the neat trick of hiding behind his work. It did not save him. On the morning of his last day, he woke before light, as he always did. The wind had calmed. The sky was a violet so dark it could double as law. He sat with his coffee, tasted metal, swore because the generator had spat again, set the cup aside, and walked into the tomb with a respirator around his neck but not over his face. The door creaked like a thing reprimanding. He had meant to be careful. He had meant to wait for Nabida. He had meant, always, to do things the right way. He had simply grown tired of meaning. He went straight to the stela. In the previous day's cleaning, Nabila had found a second layer of text under the first. The soot that had been smeared over the obvious inscription had not only hidden, it had preserved. Underneath, badly abraded, ran a second voice written in a less careful hand. The margins were filled with notes, numbers, a partial list of ingredients: bitumen, resin, malachite, natron, the breath of the cave, the phrase enclosed in a cartouche as if it were a name, a recipe, a ritual, a threat disguised as housekeeping. There were instructions: heat the bitumen until it fumes, smear it on walls, seal the room so it cannot exhale, speak the names while the smoke rises, attach the bead, obsidian, the absence of light bead, to the throat of the dead so that the breath is captured. The one who opens shall breathe as I breathed, the one who sees shall be seen. Finch reached to trace the line of the words and stopped. He had learned not to touch. He bent to read the footnote. The generator coughed. The lights flickered. In that flicker, the tomb returned to night, and then to dawn, and then to night. When the fluorescence steadied, Finch was on his knees. Nabila found him there because she had learned his habits. She knelt beside him. He was not dead. He was simply far away, eyes open, blinking as if he had been awake too long. The respirator hung useless. She tugged it up. He batted her hand away and smiled the way people smile when they are reading a book a second before the twist. "Listen," he said, "it's breathing." "Alastair," she said, with the authority of the living who believe what they say can stop the dying. "Mask. "Do you smell it?" he asked, soft and delighted, and then his pupils narrowed to pinheads, and there was blood, a nosebleed, dramatic as a warning. He wiped it on his sleeve and left a mark like a signature. They hauled him into the corridor, into
cleaner air. They sat him on a crate that had carried them there and would carry them away. The generator's rhythm steadied. A tired heart resumed. Finch insisted he was fine. He went pale the way clouds do when they have forgotten rain. He slumped. Nabila said his name the way someone says a word to make it mean something again. He opened his mouth and said with precision, "The breath of the enclosed." On his chest, under his shirt, Finch wore his grandmother's charm, a small silver crescent with a worn engraving of a word that no longer had edges. He had never been superstitious. He had no children to whom to pretend bravery. He had simply loved old things and the way they solved you while you tried to solve them. They loaded him into the car. The road out of the wadi was the same road everyone took. Everyone. The tires knew it. The driver knew it. The wind did not. A gust came. It did not kick up sand dramatically. It just pushed, a palm in the center of the vehicle's back, at the precise moment the driver tried to avoid a rock that had not been there yesterday. The car tipped, rolled, arrested its own flight with a rock outcropping that had likely been there long before either of them, or their gods. Finch bled from places he should not have. Nabila screamed for the first time in her professional life. Not a word, just a sound old as fear. He died on the good road, the smooth one, 10 minutes from the clinic, on a day that Sky made promises and kept none. It is a terrible thing when a story lands on its head. It tells you that you have been reading the wrong book. In the quiet after, when the camp heard a silence that had shape, Nabila went back to the tomb alone. This was madness. This was a tradition. She stood before the stela and read for the last time the parts the suit had kept alive. Under the recipe, there was a line that did not fit. It was neither instruction nor prayer. It was a confession. I have made the air hot with poison, so that thieves will take my heat upon them. I have tied my breath to my name, and my name to this stone. The one who opens will breathe me, but not my son, not my scribe, not the one who carries ink under his nails. The one who comes for my bead will be the first. The bead. The small obsidian bead threaded to the mummy's throat had been removed on the first day and placed in a padded box. It had been stolen 2 days later, because everything valuable is stolen at least once. They had found it in the pocket of a student who had cried so hard at his own cowardice he had nearly drowned. They had returned it to the box and placed the box in Finch's tent because he did not sleep deeply, and because he believed his presence was defense enough. The bead, cold as any night in the desert, had lain within reach of his hand. Nabila took the box now and opened it. The bead did not look like a spell or a trap. It looked like a bead, glass obsidian with a hole. Nothing. She set it on her palm. The room inhaled. It exhaled. She closed the box gently, as if the small thing had eyelids, and took it back to the sarcophagus. There are rituals even skeptics respect. Do not take without giving. Do not untie what you cannot retie. Do not breathe what the dead have claimed. Nabila set the bead back on the resin, at the base of Nesiman's throat. She pressed it into the sticky hardness and felt it catch, as if the tomb had closed over something that fit at last. For a heartbeat, the polished walls swallowed her reflection completely, and she saw nothing but black. Then the room's breath slowed, as if something had uncoiled. Was there a curse? Was there an ancient chemical scheme engineered by a scribe priest with access to poison and grievance? Was there a smuggler with a hole in his soul?
Was there a mold that learned to wake faster when there were lungs to colonize? Was there merely the arithmetic of a place that does not care who we are, that has been killing and sparing with equal indifference since the Nile first decided to be a river? 20 are dead. 20 names that once signed receipts and birth certificates and little love notes that have been read out loud in rooms that smell of flowers and formaldehyde. We can explain half of them with terms that will not pass into legend. We can explain the others only by telling the story poorer men told when the grain ran out. Do not break the seals of the dead. Do not unfasten the breath that is not yours. There is a last note, because the story loves symmetry. A month after the tomb was resealed, not sealed forever, simply closed with rituals performed old and new, the bronze cobra fell from the wall. It had been bolted there by men with better tools than those of the ancients. It had no reason. It broke into 3 pieces, clean as a lesson. Nabila picked up the head. The inlay in the eyes was not glass. It was obsidian.
In the end, as always, the desert keeps more than it gives. The tomb of Nizamun is closed now. The stela is wrapped and stored behind climate control and glass so perfect it does not exist. The bead sits in the dark. The official reports cite all the right things: environmental hazards, human error, chain of custody failures, the radical simplicity of accident. The unofficial stories refuse to be that polite. Why do tombs frighten us more than palaces or prisons? Because in them we meet 2 truths at once: that we will die and that we will be remembered only so long as our names have breath. A tomb is a device built to outwit oblivion. It is no wonder the living feel small inside them. It is no wonder that people who keep secrets in life try to keep them in death too. Curses are the oldest technology. They are not magic cast into the air. They are stories cast into the mind. Sometimes they are painted on walls. Sometimes they are baked into laws. Sometimes they are mixed with resin and bitumen until the air itself forgets not to harm. We step into these machines and tell ourselves we are immune because we have reasons. But motives survive where flesh rots. The Egyptians knew this and wrote it carefully. What you do returns to you. What you take, takes. Balance is not a moral, it is a mechanism. There are other tombs the world will whisper about when it runs out of patience for facts. Mountain caves in Anatolia that drink men. A mausoleum beneath a European church where the air kills candles and then lungs. A burial chamber in a Central Asian desert where every man who broke its seal died with blackened fingernails. Each story will offer a rational explanation. Each will also offer a handprint in red and a phrase like a thread through the years: do not enter. Perhaps the truth is this: a curse is simply a promise kept by a place, the promise that memory has teeth, the promise that reverence is not optional, the promise that the dead are not gone, only elsewhere, and that the elsewhere can be a room with polished black walls and a breath that is not ours. Another story waits, beneath another layer of gentle sand and human certainty, a forbidden city sunk in salt, a grave of a king who was not a king, a garden planted with statues that bleed when no one watches. If you want to follow where the quiet historians walk, if you want to hear the voices that do not shout, then come back. Follow the line where myth meets measurement, where the ledger and the legend touch. Like this, if you want more voices from the long night, subscribe if you prefer your history to move in whispers and footfalls. And tell me, do you believe in curses, or was it all coincidence?